EMP Series, Day 153. On Monday morning, Pastor rose early to get ready for the Board of Governors meeting in town, which was set for noon. Greg asked Steve to ride along with Dalton and Pastor for a little extra security. They would be going to pick up Ish Patel as well. Carl Fairley arrived at the church, as he usually did, to ride in along with Pastor's group. Roger rose early as well, and was already working, cutting and splitting firewood. He was offered a spot to sleep downstairs in one of the classrooms, but chose instead to pitch his tent out in the rear of the property, away from everybody and everything. At breakfast, Jillian noticed he was absent and went out back to find him working on the firewood. She told him breakfast was ready and that he should come join the group. He hesitated, but agreed after Jillian insisted. He was a loner, used to doing for himself and making his own way. On the way down to the pavilion, Jillian reminded him that he was part of a family now, that he wasn't alone anymore. This was a new concept for Roger, and he felt awkward and out of place. Jillian could see this by the look on his face. She slid her arm around his and softly said, "Don't worry, it'll get easier. It's just going to take some time. God is patient, and so are we." She smiled at him. He felt at ease. Her smile and kind words had a way of always making him feel at ease. Then his thoughts drifted to the future, when the MC would catch up with him. He wasn't concerned for himself. He made his choices in life and would accept the consequences for them. His concern was for the people around him. Specifically, he was worried about Jillian and her children. It was his intention not to be there when the club came looking for him. For the first time he could remember, he didn't want to move on. He wanted to stay here with these people, his new family, but he knew he could not. A few miles away, Samantha Bezio stood, with tears in her eyes, at the graves of her husband and oldest son. Hate and bitterness welling up in her heart. When the first member of the group arrived, they went inside together. An hour later, there were 9 men and 5 women there. They called themselves the Citizens of Liberty. It was a group that Bailey himself had started months ago at a meeting with a few like-minded neighbors right here at his kitchen table. They held to the belief that the region was better off without any governmental or authoritative rule, that the citizens could and should govern themselves. They didn't want any military presence in the region. They were against the formation of the Board of Governors as well. They were responsible for the attack on the trading post that left Bailey's oldest son and 3 other group members, as well as several soldiers, dead. An act that also led to the death of Bailey himself. Now they were planning their next move. They had learned the hard way that a head-on attack was suicide, since they could not match the firepower of the occupying military force. They decided instead to use more covert tactics. They would plan and execute a series of smaller strikes that would attack specific targets. They would then retreat into the countryside, effectively disappearing. This strategy would limit their exposure and hopefully the casualties that they would endure. They would attack in similar fashion to the way that the Iraqi and Afghani people had attacked our military in the Middle East. If done correctly, nobody would see or even know who was doing the attacking. They had been aggressively planning since Bailey's death. Now they were ready for action. Pastor and Ish Patel, along with Carl Fairley, actually wanted almost the same thing as the Citizens of Liberty. While they knew that the military was here to stay and believed that they were needed in some capacity, they wanted to limit the scope of power and authority that they had in the region. They wanted the new government to be as small as possible. They believed in the autonomy of the people and their right to govern themselves. They chose, however, to go about it differently. They chose to work within the system to effect the change they desired, to be involved in the formation of the new government, and to shape the policies that they would be using going forward. They, as well as the Citizens of Liberty, were seeking similar results, but had very different approaches to how they would attempt to achieve those results. After having a cup of coffee together, Pastor and Carl, along with Steve and Dalton, rolled out to pick up Ish and head into town for the Board of Governors meeting. In town, Major Stillman was preparing for the meeting as well. He was in his office with George Henderson and Leroy McMillan. They were forming plans to further their own agenda. When Pastor, Carl, and Ish arrived, they, along with McMillan, Henderson, and Major Stillman, went upstairs to start the meeting. It was clear to all that Leroy McMillan would be installed as the chairman of the board. Pastor and Ish didn't mind this at all. In fact, neither one of them had any desire to lead this group. Carl Fairley couldn't do it because he wasn't actually a member of the board. He attended the meetings only because of his position as constable for the region. That was perfectly fine with him as well. Yes, if Leroy McMillan wanted to run this circus, nobody was going to oppose it. When the meeting was called to order, there was a man sitting outside on the platform. He was casually watching and keeping track of everything that was going on, and of everyone that was coming and going. He was Marcus Wells. He was the brother of Butch Wells, who was shot and killed during the attack on the post last week. In fact, the group calling itself the Citizens of Liberty had a person in town watching every day. They were gathering information to use in the planning of their attacks. The Citizens of Liberty broke up the meeting around the same time that the Board of Governors started theirs. They left the Bezio homestead and headed south toward the town. The train was due in from the south to arrive in town about 3 p.m. If their plan was successful, that train would never arrive. Riding on old dirt bikes and in a 1967 Chevy van, the group made its way through town and onto an old access road adjacent to the train tracks. Stopping at the end of the road. From there, they walked several hundred yards into the woods and came out on the track near a trestle that crossed high above the river in the valley below. One of the members of the group used to do flood control in the region and had a decent-sized stockpile of dynamite, which he used to blow up beaver dams. They bundled several pieces into 2 separate bundles and armed them with the blasting caps. They then placed them on the support pilings that held the bridge that the tracks were on. One of the group members who lost her husband in the trading post attack wanted to detonate the dynamite at the last second when it would be too late for the train to stop, sending it careening over the edge and into the river far below. This would mean certain death for all on board. After much heated discussion, the group, which was divided on the issue, decided to blow the dynamite in enough time in advance to give the train ample time to stop before going over the edge. One of the members successfully argued that while they had no reservations about killing a member of the military which sought to control them, he would not kill innocent people. He was not willing to cross that line. Most agreed, and the decision was made. On the opposite side of the bridge from the direction that the train would approach, closest to town, a member of the group lay prone with his .308 scoped rifle trained on the spot where the dynamite was planted. The rest of the group sat on the access road near the vehicles, the detonator sitting in the front passenger seat of the van. They heard the train before they saw it coming, up just around the bend. The leader radioed to the sniper on the other side of the river to get ready. He then picked up the detonator and clicked the selector switch to the right. The explosion was massive. It was intense enough to blow up half a city block. It would surely be seen and heard for miles around. After detonating the dynamite, the group mounted the dirt bikes, piled into the van, and sped off up the access road toward the bridge that they had crossed, up the river about half a mile. As the train slowed to a stop, the conductor stepped off first, followed by another railroad worker. Then an army captain and his lieutenant followed. The sniper took aim and fired once. The captain fell dead onto the tracks. Then, before anyone could react, another shot rang out, and the lieutenant fell dead as well. The sniper picked up the 2 spent casings and slid them into his pocket. He stood up and swiftly ran down the trail and onto the dirt access road, and continued to jog, heading south back toward the vehicle bridge. Within minutes he saw the group approach, and as the van stopped briefly, he jumped into the back. They sped off toward home. In town, at the Board of Governors meeting, they heard and felt the explosion. Carl Fairley looked out the window to the south to see the massive fireball and the smoke it emitted. For the second time within days, the citizens of Liberty had attacked and had been successful in cutting the board meeting short. Carl Fairley ran downstairs and got on his horse, rode as fast as he could toward the explosion. Major Stillman ordered Lieutenant Saunders to grab a detail and head there as well. Dalton and Steve ran upstairs and hurried Pastor and Ish along downstairs and into the power wagon. They headed for home. The explosion was heard back at the church as well. Richie, who was in the tower, saw it and told Greg what he saw. Greg immediately put the compound into lockdown, and everyone was put on alert. When Carl Fairley arrived at the site of the demolished trestle, he interviewed the conductor and the rail worker. Neither had seen anything, except for the conductor, who reported only seeing a man get up from the tracks and run off into the woods, following the murder of the captain and the lieutenant. He couldn't see him well enough to identify him. He didn't even know if it was a man or a woman. It was a long way off, he said, and he only saw him very briefly. When Lieutenant Saunders arrived, his men loaded the 2 officers' bodies into one of the jeeps. The 2 rail workers got into the other jeep. They all headed for town. The train only held the conductor and the railman, as well as the 2 Army officers and 4 soldiers in their detail. The 4 soldiers were left to guard the train, which was loaded with supplies. Carl Fairley carefully investigated the site where the dynamite was placed. as well as the area along the access road, and the location of where the sniper was seen. He did notice tire tracks on the access road, some of which appeared to be those found commonly on dirt bikes. He remained on scene till dark, taking careful notes of everything that he observed.